Well, a very good evening to you from my home, Bethel House in North Wales, on a beautiful sunny evening in June. The year's gone very quickly, hasn't it? And we're now on Module 5 of the Hidden Treasures course. And we extended Module 4 into 3 parts because it was so extensive, and there's quite a lot of teaching in that, which is challenging. I know there were a number of questions, and I hope they've all been answered and to your satisfaction. But we move on from that now, from the story of the lies and the libels and the persecution of the Jews and the intensity of propaganda and lies against the Jewish people, to the culmination and the consequences of the terrible period in history, 2,000 years of history, compounded by the Christian church, which resulted in the murder of 6 million Jews. And I know that this subject to some will be painful, because some of you will have lost family and lost relatives in the Holocaust, and some of you may be even survivors of the Holocaust, or who have parents who survived the Holocaust but live still with the consequences of the terrible trauma that they experienced, that your parents probably experienced in Eastern Europe and in Nazi Germany, France and Holland, and all the German occupied countries. And I know that the trauma still affects the second generation. I attended a conference in Yad Vashem about 3 years ago, where the whole subject of second generation trauma was discussed, and we had speakers who were second generation, who had really struggled with their upbringing because their parents had been through such horrible events, and found it difficult to relate. So we know that the consequences are still carrying on, that there is still pain, and that there is still trauma resulting from the terrible period under Nazi rule in Europe during the period of the war, 1939 to 1945. So we're going to try and look at some aspects of this. Now, before I start, I want to tell you that we're not going to discuss in detail any of the terrible the terrible incidents that happened in Holocaust. We're going to look mainly at principles and what led up to the Holocaust. And I want to say as well that I'm also on a Wednesday night presenting a Holocaust course, which is quite extensive and quite detailed. And that does actually go into some of the situations that Jews found themselves in when they were detained and transported to the death camps, and also shot in the killing fields. And I do look at that in more detail, but for this module tonight, it's just an hour's module, and we look at some of the principles. We can never really understand Holocaust. Although I had 80 hours of lectures at Yad Vashem from the best experts in Holocaust studies, Yehuda Bauer, Robert Wistrich, and Ephraim K. and Steffi K. and many others at Yad Vashem, experts at Yad Vashem, Franklin H. Littell, and many others. Although I had all that input and I studied really hard and read a lot, I still don't understand Holocaust because of the intensity of violence and the deplorable attitude and behavior of ordinary people who became killers. And we can never really understand that. But I'm going to present it in the best way that I can. And when I've done this now, presented it in this way for the last 15 years. And it gives, I think, a broader outlook on what happened and what led up to the Holocaust. But if you do want to go into more detail, then you can pick up my Wednesday night Holocaust teachings on the same channel as you're watching now. But before I start, I want to just recommend some books to you. I recommend a lot of books. I've got quite an extensive library here and at Father's house at the church on the Holocaust. And to give a broader reading for you, I want to present this book to you by Robert P. Watson, and it's a book called the Nazi Titanic, and it's about a ship called the Cap Arcona, and the Cap Arcona with two other ships were blown up by the British Air Force just as the war was ending, and the ships were carrying prisoners which had been in the Neuengamme murder camp near Hamburg during the war, and they were being taken away from Germany out of danger when the ship was bombed by the British Air Force. And that book gives you some of the background into that. That was right at the end of the war. But something that happened again at the beginning of the war was the story of the St. Louis, which was a ship that was carrying people in 1938, 1939, carrying people out of Germany, out of Europe, to safety in Cuba, and eventually they tried to land in America. But the ship was allowed or not allowed to dock in the ports where it was intended to dock and disembark the Jewish refugees on board. They were actually sent back to Europe, and many died in the Holocaust. And this book, called A Voyage of the Damned, by Gordon Thomas and Max Morgan Wills, is a really good book as well. You can get both these books on the internet, and that just gives you a bit of background as to what happened before and after the Second World War. And also I've got a book called Churches and the Holocaust by Mordecai Paldiel, and that's a really good book. That tells a lot of the stories of the churches and how they were complicit in some ways with Nazi Germany. And in this little book it has chapters on Belgium, the Netherlands, France, Germany, of course, Italy, and some work on studies that the author made on the Vatican. And finally, the last recommend that I've got, although I could give you a lot of recommendations, but this is a really easy book to understand. It's called Atlas of the Holocaust by Martin Gilbert, and I mentioned Martin Gilbert before to you. Martin Gilbert is a great historian. He was the Queen's biographer, and he's well worth reading. But let me move on now and begin the study. First of all, we always look at scriptures and see what God says about the Holocaust and what he says about the Jewish people in the diaspora. Now, I'm going to read an email from Shirley Segev. I'm hoping you're with us, Shirley, about her family, and I'm going to come to that in a short while when we look at some of the families who were involved in Holocaust. And Shirley tells of the story about what happened to her family in Holocaust, and this may give some comfort to you. I'm hoping it will, and to those of you who may be our second generation, or those of you who have lost a family in the Holocaust. It's Zechariah 1, chapter 1, verses 8 and 9. And the story here is that Zechariah had received 8 visions during one night during his ministry, and those visions all spoke about Israel, and Israel in the diaspora, Israel without friends, and Israel unsupported by the nations, but certainly supported by God. And this verse says this is the first vision that he has. It says, "In the night I saw a man riding on a red horse. He was standing amongst the myrtle trees in the glen, and behind him was a red sorrel and white horse. Then I said, 'What are these, my Lord?' And the angel talked with me, said, 'I will show you what they are.' So the man who was standing among the myrtle trees answered, 'These are those whom the Lord has sent to patrol the earth.'" Now, when we try and look at this scripture in depth, we see that the man on the red horse would be the Messiah, the angel of God, or we would believe is Yeshua. The Jewish people would believe he would be the angel of God. And he's on a red horse of judgment. and the myrtle trees would represent Israel. Myrtle represents the nation of Israel, as does the olive and the fig tree. But myrtle is also symbolic of the nation of Israel. And the myrtle is low growing, it's humble, but it has a beautiful perfume, a beautiful scent to it. I've got a myrtle tree, they're absolutely beautiful. And Israel is that to God. It's a nation who he loves, who is low growing and small, and yet to God it has a beautiful fragrance. And where is it? This myrtle tree, or the myrtle here, is in the glen or the pit in some translations, and that means the nations. So we see that the Messiah, or the angel of God, is in the center of the Jewish people who are in the nations, out in the diaspora. And what it indicates to us is that the man on the red horse of judgment is there. He's judging the nations for how they've dealt with Israel. And how do we know that? Well, if we move on, and the scriptures are in your manual, if we move on to verse 15 of the same chapter, we see, and I'm extremely angry with the nations that are at ease. For while I was only a little angry, they made the disaster worse. Now, that's very clear that God punished the nation of Israel for not keeping his Torah, not following the commands that God had given them to keep the Sabbath, the feasts, but also the idolatry that Israel was involved in. And before I go any further, I want to make it clear to you that we in the Christian community can't criticize the Jewish people for that, because we are in as much idolatry within the Christian church, with icons and with the worship of Mary and many other things. So we can't, it's like calling the kettle black. We all have something to learn about following God and the need to follow him in the way that he wants us to follow him. But it says here that he was extremely angry with the nations because they were at ease. Now, what it means is that they were apathetic about the Jewish people, that they didn't care about the Jewish people. They didn't look after them while they're in the diaspora. They didn't concern themselves with the Jewish people except to punish them and persecute them. And he says, but they made the disaster worse. So God punished the Jewish people, sending them into the nations. Because of their sin, they're in the nations, but then the nations added to the disaster of them being out of the land of Israel. And what did the nations do? Well, we, since the 2nd century, as Gentile nations, have punished and persecuted the Jewish people right throughout our history. And I think I said last week, didn't I? I went over some of the story about the Inquisition and the Crusades and those things that were cruel towards the Jewish people, and saw the Christians murder Jewish people in the name of Yeshua and in the name of Jesus right throughout history. And it culminated in the Holocaust. And of course, God did not cause the Holocaust to happen. What we're learning here from Zechariah is actually the nations added to the punishment. Now, I want you to think, if you were to have smacked your child when the child was young and naughty and needed discipline, if you just tapped the child, you would have done that in love. That's what we do as parents. We do things in love to our children to discipline them, but we would never go too far because we love the child. But what if your neighbor came in and did the same thing? Would your neighbor do that in love? No. The neighbor would probably hit a lot harder and really hurt your child. How would you feel as a parent? You would be really, really upset about it, wouldn't you? And that takes us to chapter 2 of Zechariah, because chapter 2 says, it's chapter 2, verse 8, I'm sorry. Thus said the Lord of hosts, after his glory sent me, regarding the nations that plundered you, truly, the one who touches you touches the apple of my eye. what God is saying is that anybody who hurts the nation of Israel, it's like poking your finger into God's eye. And that's what the nations have done to the nations of Israel. And we see in Joel 3:2 that God is going to judge the nations for how they've dealt with Israel, and He's going to bring them to the valley of Jehoshaphat, and there He will judge them with regards to Israel. And Yeshua in Matthew 25 says exactly the same thing, that He will, when He comes back, will call the nations of the earth to account at the valley of Jehoshaphat. And he goes on in Matthew 25 to say, it's because of the way that they've dealt with my people, he says, my brothers, my people Israel. So that's they're the scriptures that I'm going to read tonight, the first scriptures that we're going to read. But how does it all begin? Now, I've gone through this in the Holocaust course that I did, that I'm doing, right at the beginning, when we looked at the stages of genocide. And the stages of genocide, which is what Holocaust is, are stages in which a dehumanizing process takes place, enabling people to kill human beings, believing that those human beings are not human. So if we look at the dehumanizing process, which took place years before the Holocaust. Well, actually, it's taken place for nearly 2,000 years before the Holocaust. But if we look at the process, even from 1933 onwards, we find that Jews were dehumanized in the eyes of Christians and in the eyes of non-believing communities in Europe just before the Holocaust. Now, I want to talk about this from the point of view of my experience as a detective involved in murder investigations and serious crime investigations. And in most cases, the murderer or the person committing serious physical crime against individuals, in their minds, they don't see the victim as being human. They've dehumanized the victim in their minds. Now, the first case of murder I ever dealt with, or not dealt with, but was part of, was involving a woman who had a drunken husband, and he would go out most nights and drink and come back drunk, and he used to beat her and punish her. And one night she put a hammer under her pillow. And when he came in drunk and lay on the bed, she hit him and she killed him, actually, with the hammer. And when she was interviewed, really, she didn't, by that time, believe that her husband was human. She couldn't see him as being her husband. She'd taken it one step further. He was inhuman, and he wasn't a human being to her, which enabled her to kill him much more easier than it would have been if she'd have thought of him as a loving husband. So this process takes place, and that process is what happened in Germany and German occupied territory throughout Europe. It was a process of years and years of dehumanization that took place. And history has shown that there's been this process of dehumanizing which made the Holocaust possible. And sadly, Christendom began and continued this process, which enabled the killing of 6 million Jews possible. Now, I can say that to you, but I'm going to quote some historians now and help us to understand from the point of view of historical fact. Stephen R. Haynes, a historian, wrote this. He said, "Those who study the relationship between Christianity and the Holocaust have very concisely described the connection. Although Christian anti-Judaism did not by itself make the Holocaust possible, the murder of 6 million Jews by Nazis and their accomplices could not have occurred without Christianity. This means very simply that the Holocaust is a Christian event, a watershed in church history." And he went on to say that thousands of baptized Protestants participated as perpetrators in the Nazi final solution of the Jewish question. Whilst it is tempting for Christians to deny that any genuine Protestant could participate in mass murder, much less against members of God's chosen people, the fact is that persons from every Protestant tradition aided the genocide. Many Protestant Christians who did not perpetrate violence against the Jews were nonetheless collaborators in Nazi anti-Semitism. And we're going to look at the German Christian Party soon to put some meat on the bones from Haynes's comment here. Now, Haynes acknowledges that thousands of Protestants did help try to rescue Jews, but he goes on to say the vast majority of Christians were neither perpetrators nor resistors, but were rather bystanders who did not contribute directly to the murder of Jews, but did nothing to thwart it. Now, I want to just mention here now that Haynes wrote this comment probably 20 years ago, and since then there has been a lot of work done, research done by the Washington Holocaust Museum and Yad Vashem to show that actually, instead of us thinking there was just a few camps and a few ghettos, that actually there were 44,000 camps and ghettos in German occupied territory. So I would think that if you count the transports that took place, the numbers of camps, that actually the majority of people did know, and many people aided just by driving trains, being the cashier at a train station, or even just being part of the cleaning of uniforms, the laundries and things. That took effort by ordinary people who were aware of what was happening. So maybe Haynes would go on a little bit further now if that information was known. Now, another historian by the name of Victoria J. Barnett said this. She said, in Nazi Germany in September 1935, there were few Christians in the Protestant confessing church who demanded that their church take a public stand in defense of the Jews. Their efforts, however, were overruled by church leaders who wanted to avoid any conflict with the Nazi regime. She also states, moreover, and particularly in the German Evangelical Church, the largest Protestant church in Germany, the allegiance to the concept of Christendom was linked to a strong nationalism. She goes on to say that throughout the 1930s, there was ample evidence of anti-Semitism in many sermons and in articles that appeared in German church publications. Some church leaders proudly announced that they were anti-Semites. Others warned their colleagues of any public show of support for the Jewish victims of the Nazi regime. Christian anti-Semitism often complicated other factors or complemented other factors, notably the strong nationalism in the German Protestant churches. The most extreme example of this combination of anti-Semitism and nationalism was the so-called German Christian movement, a Protestant group that embraced Nazism and tried to Nazify Christianity by suppressing the Old Testament, revising liturgics and hymns, and promoting Jesus as an Aryan hero who embraced the ideals of the new Germany. Another historian, a Canon Gareth Lloyd-Jones from the university just down the road from me here in North Wales at Bangor, said this. He said, since 1945, many detailed accounts have been written of anti-Jewish polemic in Christian literature. With few exceptions, they begin with the major theologians of the 2nd century, spurred into action by the claim that there is a direct link between the Nazi Holocaust and the church's negative attitude towards Judaism. Scholars have subjected the views of the early church fathers to close scrutiny. Their research has demonstrated that antipathy towards Jews is never far from the surface in the writings of some of the most influential theologians. Consequently, this teaching of contempt, as the early church presentation of Judaism has been aptly described, is regarded as containing the seeds of modern anti-Semitism. So as we looked in the previous module, we looked at Christian anti-Semitism as fueling anti-Semitism and hatred of the Jews. What Gareth Lloyd-Jones is saying is they were the seeds of the modern anti-Semitism which enabled the Holocaust to take place. So we can see that the church played a major role in dehumanizing the Jewish people in the eyes of the Europeans. Now, I want to pick the story up in the 1870s in regards to Christian anti-Semitism, because we've looked at the early church fathers and what they said to increase anti-Semitism and polarize the church from the Jewish people, and also to feed into the anti-Semitism which would lead to the Holocaust. So, but 1870, we're moving towards the time when Clara Hitler was alive, and Adolf Hitler was born, and then, well, he wasn't born actually then, but shortly after, and would be influenced by what churches said. Now, Pope Pius IX in 1871 told a women's group, before the time of Jesus, the Jews had been children in the house of God, but all this had changed owing to their obstinacy and their failure to believe. They have become dogs, he told this women's group. We have in Rome today too many of these dogs, and we hear them barking in all the streets and going around molesting people everywhere. Now, that's a terrible thing to say about a group of people who are God's chosen people, and who actually we are connected with spiritually. In 1880, in the Jesuit bi-weekly Civilta Cattolica, which would have been read in Austria, where Hitler was born, and read right throughout Europe, they wrote, Jews were obligated by their religion to hate non-Jews, and as a consequence, Christians despise them. Societies have to protect themselves from Jews, and governments would be well advised to introduce exceptional laws for a race that is so exceptionally and profoundly perverse. In another article, the same paper wrote, the same year, as history has shown, if this foreign Jewish race is left too free, it immediately becomes the persecutor, oppressor, tyrant, thief, and devastator of the country where it lives. Special laws must be introduced to keep the Jews in their place. Now, Father Oreglia, a writer for the paper, compared Jews to wolves and said they should not be set free. Again, another daily paper, the Vatican Daily Osservatore Romano, wrote this: anti-Semitism ought to be the natural, sober, thoughtful Christian reaction against Jewish predominance. And the article continued, true anti-Semitism is and can be in substance nothing other than Christianity completed and perfected in Catholicism. Terrible anti-Semitic statements which would cause people to hate the Jews. In the 1920s, many clergy supported the protocols of the Elders of Zion, and those were written in 1880 in Russia they were lies, 17 lies, protocols as they were called, against the Jewish people. And they say these protocols were allegedly written by Jewish people about wanting to rule the world. The whole thing was made up by Russian anti-Semites who wanted to persecute Jews and to have a foundation with which they could spread hatred against Jews. And that's what the protocols were. But Monsignor Yuan wrote in the 1920s about the protocols. He says, from the triple viewpoint of race, nationality, and religion, the Jew has become the enemy of humanity. A year later, Monsignor Yuan was congratulated on his work by Cardinal Gaspari of Rome. Anti-Semitism was the normal understanding in the Catholic Church, but also in the German Protestant Church. In 1920, Father Rosa said this. He said, the Jews were to blame for the Russian Revolution, as they had been for the French Revolution. Again, all lies. By 1930s in Austria, considered to be a Catholic state and the birthplace of Hitler, anti-Semitism was a daily occurrence in church publications. Cardinal Lond from Poland, leading churchman in 1936, this was 3 years after Hitler came to power, he said this, that the Jews were the vanguard of atheism. He encouraged the boycott of Jewish businesses and warned that the Jews were waging war against the Catholic Church. Of course, it's not true. Now, on the eve of Kristallnacht, 1938, Kristallnacht was a culmination of a program of planning by the Nazi Party to attack and arrest and destroy Jewish businesses and shops. And on the 9th of November, 1938, this plan came into being, whereby instructions were given to destroy shops, houses, and arrest Jews and beat Jews, and also burn synagogues and all the Jewish books. Now, on the eve of that incident, Father Mario Barbara wrote in the Catholic press, Civiltà Cattolica, he wrote this, bearing in mind that 24 hours later, there was this terrible attack on the Jewish people of Austria and Germany. He said, the Jewish question will remain unsolved because, as all agree, even those most kindly disposed towards the Jews, their corrupt messianicism, that is their fatal craving for worldwide financial and political domination, is the true cause that makes Judaism a font of disorders and a permanent danger for the world. That would incite so much hatred. And we can understand why ordinary people got involved in Kristallnacht and Night of Broken Glass, because of such statements. In Berlin in 1935, Hitler and Archbishop Caesarea Ocenego attended functions together. The church was very, very close, both Catholic and Protestant church, to the Nazi Party. Going back a little bit now to the Protestant church, Reverend Adolf Stoker, who was born on the 11th of December 1935, became the Protestant chaplain to Kaiser Wilhelm. And he founded one of the first anti-Semitic political parties in Germany, called the Christian Socialist Workers' Party. A staunch anti-Semite, Stoker was a believer in Virgindom, the idea that German culture was being Jewified and corrupted by the newly emancipated Jews. At first, Stoker's party enjoyed little success, but it gained a lot of popularity after it adopted a more aggressive anti-Semitic agenda. And in 1879, he delivered a speech entitled "What We Demand of Modern Jewry," in which he spelled out several demands of German Jews. Among these were that quotas be placed on the number of Jews in certain professions and universities. Now, as per the last module, we went into that many of the laws that Hitler put into the Nuremberg laws were actually taken from church laws, and that is another example of church attitude towards the Jewish people being adopted by Nazi Germany. Now, the German Christian Party, probably the most anti-Semitic of all. People say, oh, well, it was the Catholics who were the most anti-Semitic, but actually the truth of it is that the German Protestant community were the most anti-Semitic of the two major religions. And if we look at the numbers of Protestants and Catholics in Germany and Austria in 1939, we see that 65% of people were of the Protestant persuasion, and 35% in the main were Catholic. Now, the most anti-Semitic Christian organization in Germany was the German Christian Movement, founded in 1920 by two Protestant German pastors. By the mid-1930s, the German Christian Movement membership had reached 500,000, who fully endorsed the Nazi ideology. In April 1939, German Christian churches signed up to something called the Goldsburg Declaration, which stated that Judaism was opposite to Christianity. And they announced the creation of the Institute for the Research into the Elimination of Jewish Influence in German church life. And I do go into a lot of detail about that in the Holocaust course, but I'm going to just touch on some things about this Institute for the Study of the Eradication of Jewish Influence in church life. It was established on the 6th of May, 1939, by the German Christian Protestant movement. The German Christian movement had a membership of over 6,000 pastors, bishops, professors of theology, religious teachers, and laity. So it was no small group of Christian anti-Semites. The movement was not a separate denomination, but a faction within the Protestant church in Germany. So it wasn't a separate group. The Institute taught that Yeshua was not a Jew. That teaching came out of a guy called Walter Grunman, who I'm going to tell you about very shortly. And they called for the eradication of Jewish influence in the church. They called for a total de-Judaization of the church and Christianity. It's impossible to think of that, but that's what they wanted. They taught that Yeshua opposed the Sabbath and Judaism, and that was the reason for his crucifixion. Absolutely untrue, but that's what they taught. They said that Jews murdered Yeshua. That wasn't right, as you know, it was the Romans. And they taught that Judaism was totally opposite to Christianity. Now, the German Christian Party removed all references to Jews in hymn books and created a new Bible. Sorry, I've just lost my place. But now let's have a look at some of the key players in the German Christian movement. The Protestant theologian Gerhardt Kittel. He made a speech on the 1st of June 1933. This was just 3 months after Hitler came to power. And he called the speech the Jewish problem, in which he examined 4 ways to eliminate Jews. In his speech, he proposed that Jews should lose German citizenship and should be given guest status only. That would mean that they had no rights at all. He proposed expulsion and assimilation, but he ruled that out because you couldn't assimilate blood, he went on to say. And then he spoke about extermination. And that's the first reference that I can find, and maybe you can find an earlier one, where a theologian speaks about extermination of the Jews from Europe. Now, he didn't talk about murder, but he did speak about extermination. That's another way of dealing with the Jews, he said. What he really meant by that, really, I don't know. But what he did, it fueled Nazi Germany's program of the idea of extermination of Jews from Europe. Kittel, he spoke of Jews as refuse, a poison and corruption, he said, which eats at the marrow of the Volk. He taught college courses on the Jewish question and recommended barring Jews from professional work and education. Between 1939 to 1943, he headed, along with Grunman, who we'll talk about now, he headed the Institution for the Study and Eradication of Jewish Influence in German church life. One of his other leaders, Walter Grunman, was the leader of the Institution for the Research into the Elimination of the Influence in German church life. And Grunman, in 1939, called for the removal of any Jewish influence in the church whatsoever. He taught that Yeshua was an Aryan, And I've got a book by his I can't translate it, it's in German, but I do know, I have translated little bits of it. And here, what he was trying to say is that because Yeshua was born in the Galilee, he wasn't actually Jewish. He was Arab, speaking Aramaic, and he suggested that Yeshua didn't even speak Hebrew. So he's taught that Yeshua was an Aryan. And he said that Christianity is the unbridgeable religious opposition to Judaism. Grunman's instructions regarding candidates for members of the Institute, if you wanted to be a member of the Institute, he said that every candidate for membership had to prove that he has a thorough knowledge of racial theory and laws of heredity. He's talking because he was talking about Jewish blood and Jewish genealogy. He wanted all the candidates to understand about that and be able to identify Jews. The test can only be passed if it demonstrates that the candidate clearly recognizes the fundamental, unbridgeable antagonism between the Jewish religion and the Christian faith, and can substantiate that the recognition of this antagonism decisively influences his scholarly and practical work. And then we have other leaders like Siegfried Leffler, Christian leader in the Thuringian Ministry of Education. He was a leader, he was the official there. He said, even if I know thou shalt not kill is a commandment of God, thou shalt love the Jew, because he too is a child of the eternal Father, I am able to know as well that I have to kill him. I have to shoot him. And I can only do that if I am permitted to say Christ. What he's saying is that you're allowed to kill Jews. This is a Christian leader. He said there were no oppositions to Leffler's statement. Another Christian leader was the Reich Bishop Ludwig Müller, and he changed the commandments of God in 1936 to read, "You shall do no murder, but whosoever tries to ruin him morally or threatens to assault him destroys the national fellowship and makes himself deserving of the severest punishment before God and man." He also changed the Sermon of the Mount to read, "Happy is he who makes himself a good comrade, he will make his way in the world." And then he goes on to say, "Happy is he who bears his sufferings like a man, he will find strength never to despair without courage." Totally ungodly statements. Bishop Heinz Weidmann of Bremen, 1936 onwards, he removed references to Jews from the Gospels. I don't know how you do that, but he did. And rewrote hymns and removed others which referenced Jews, Jerusalem, and Israel. And if you want to know more about that, then you can look at my presentation on Holocaust on a Wednesday evening, now recorded on YouTube. But that was the Christian church, and I just want to say to those Christians who are listening that when we looked at the scriptures in Zechariah, it was clear that God was with the Jewish people during the Holocaust. The question is, during Holocaust education, is always, where was God in the Holocaust? And the answer is, actually, where was humanity? God was with the Jewish people because he said he would never leave them or forsake them. But my point is, he's seen everything that's taken place. He's seen what the church did during the Holocaust, and he's recorded that, ready for a final judgment. So it puts the church in a different light. I wrote a little book called Rose-Tinted Memory. And I wrote it so that we would understand that the church can't look back in history with rose-tinted glasses saying that we were rescuers, when actually the truth of it is that we were persecutors, and we fueled the persecution. But I want to move on now to a more political side of Germany, because I am not saying at all that Hitler was innocent. He was the most evil man that history has known. And and he was to blame for the Holocaust. But and he used a great deal of propaganda. Now, if you Google Nazi Germany propaganda, you will come across a lot of posters, a lot of pictures, and cartoons, which actually would instill hatred into the population. So pieces of propaganda posters that show depict a large man in a big coat with a big nose giving sweets to children would make a Christian family very frightened that this man was going to steal the children, and depicts this man as a paedophile. And that's what Hitler wanted, as the population to think that Jewish people were paedophiles. A grotesque propaganda posters, and there were propaganda posters to show that Jews were poisonous. There's one of a mushroom or a toadstool on the top of a Jewish man with the Star of David. The Nazi propaganda that Jews killed Jesus was prolific in Nazi Germany, and Hitler used that to the best advantage. And also propaganda cartoons to show that Jews were, you'll see it, a picture of a big fat man with a big nose and a big bag of money, being lazy and sitting down. And next to that is an Aryan who's tall, slim, and hardworking. It portrays a picture which is untrue of the Jewish people. Of course, it's untrue, and portrays a picture of the Aryans as being a superior race. And it puts in the mind of ordinary people a hatred for the Jewish people, so much so that they despised many Jews. Now, there are 4 groups of people in any genocide, and Holocaust depicts these groups of people in a very easy way, because we can define these groups very easily in Holocaust, because in Holocaust there were victims, and they were made up, of course, of Jews. They were the main target. Holocaust is a Jewish story. It's a Jewish narrative. Jews were the main victims, but also in the victims were homosexuals, gypsies, Serbs, physically and mentally handicapped people, sympathizers and political prisoners. And they were the victims group. Then there were the perpetrators. And of course, Nazi party members were the perpetrators. Anti-Semitic communities, Nazi sympathizers, clergy, as I've said, and ordinary Christians who joined the police battalions. And you can, again, in my presentation on Holocaust on a Wednesday, I talk quite a lot about the police battalions. And ordinary police and soldiers, and they were the perpetrators. Bystanders are the 3rd group, and these are communities and individuals who were apathetic towards the Jews, who watched the Jews being taken and did nothing. They didn't care. Those who were in fear of acting were also bystanders. Christian groups who feared reprisals. Business people who relied upon the Jews' loss for their business and their situation. And I talk a lot of, not a lot, but I do have teachings on the Wednesday nights about businesses in Holocaust, German businesses who made a lot of money. And you might be interested to know that the SS administration was a business on its own, making money out of the death of Jews. Silence in this group of bystanders. I want to say about the bystanders is really then there's no such group as such. You can bracket it as bystanders, but silence constitutes a decision not to act. And silence can also indicate support or affirmation for the murder. And that's what happened, really. Those who were silent were affirming what was happening in Germany, and the church did a great deal of that. the Pope Pius was the Pope during the Holocaust, and he is called the silent Pope because he said nothing, and he said he did nothing at all, but actually indicated support and affirmation for the Nazi Party. And in fact, he was Cardinal Priscilli of Berlin in 1933, and he signed an agreement with Nazi Germany to support them in 1933, and that agreement is called the Concordat. You can see that on Google if you want to Google that. And then the fourth group is the rescuers. and actually there were Nazi Party members who were rescuers, surprisingly, but there were, and I'm going to mention one of those shortly. There were ordinary soldiers who tried to help. There were clergymen who tried to help, and there were Christian rescuers. I know I sound as if I'm saying there isn't any rescuers, but there were lots of Christian rescuers, men and women who gave their lives to try and rescue Jewish people. There are lots of stories about that. Christian and non-Christian families were rescuers. In fact, when you look at the rescuers in Holocaust, it appears that the figures show that there were more non-Christian rescuers than there were rescuers. I mean, Schindler himself was non-Christian, and that seems to be the case. And individuals became rescuers, like Schindler, for instance, but there were many individuals. And of course, there were Jewish rescuers, and we're going to mention one of those very shortly. So, who are the people who were murdered in Holocaust? Well, I have a presentation on a PowerPoint, but I'll just read some of about some of the families and some of the people who were either rescuers, bystanders, perpetrators, or rescuers in Holocaust. And the first family I want to read about is the Mary Bondi family. And she had children and grandchildren. Mary was born a Christian, but she'd married a Jew who had died before the war. Under Nazi law, her 4 children were considered Jews. They and their children were all deported. Willie to Auschwitz, daughters Mina and Julie with their children to Terezin, and her 3rd daughter, Elsa, with her family to an unknown destination. And that was the Bondi family. And they were Michelings, as they called, half Jew, half Christian. And that was the Bondi family. Now, I've asked Shirley Seger from Canada if I can read part of her email about her own family. And Shirley listens with us, and I'm hoping Shirley you'll be able to meet Shirley on a presentation, either on Zoom or in another way. But Shirley is Jewish. She teaches in a synagogue in her community, and I'm looking forward to some of her teaching coming into Father's house and giving us an understanding of some of the things that the Jewish people do in Canada. And but Shirley sent me this about her family. She says, I'm thinking of next week, though, on the Holocaust, a tough subject for me, as I lost my grandparents, my father lost his wife and 3 small children, and also 2 of his sisters and 8 nephews, all gassed in Auschwitz. They were the Sachs family on my father's side, I think possibly from Wales, as per my uncle's Abraham Sachs story, a general in the Israeli army. On my mother's side, I lost my grandmother to typhus and an aunt and many cousins in Transnistria, a concentration camp in the Ukraine. Shirley, thank you for sharing that with us. That is really hard for us to understand, the terrible trauma your family have suffered and the persecution they've suffered during Holocaust. So we're really privileged to have you with us, and I'm sure most of the other people taking part in this course will really want to hear you tell us the story about your family. And I'd like to know more about to Abraham Sachs as well, who was a general in the Israeli army. I'm fascinated about your family. So like the Bondi family, practically the whole family were murdered. So we move on now. I mentioned Jewish rescuers, and one of my favorite Jewish rescuers is Hannah Shenesh. Now, you may or may not have heard of Hannah, but she was aged 22 in 1943 and was one of 240 Jews from Israel who joined the British Army and volunteered to parachute into Europe to fight the Nazis. Hannah parachuted into Nazi-occupied Serbia in 1944 and was caught trying to cross the Hungarian border. After months of torture by the Gestapo, Hannah was executed. Now, Hannah was an amazing poet. If you Google Hannah Shenesh, you'll get the story that she was trying to get into Hungary to warn the Hungarian Jews of the plans to murder them in Auschwitz. And she tried to get in there, and she was with two others as well. And when they found a lot of opposition to their mission to get into Hungary, the other two left Hannah alone. And she decided she was going to go alone and to try and warn the Hungarian Jews. And she was actually caught and tortured. But her poetry is online, and her story is online. Hannah Shenesh. It's HANASENESH. Wonderful story to hear about Jewish rescuers. What about the persecutors, though? Well, there were people like Reinhard Heydrich. Heydrich was responsible. This is a married man with children. That's the point I want to make as well. For organizing the murder of every Jewish man, woman, and child in Europe. In 1941, Heydrich ordered 4 killing squads called the Einsatzgruppen to move from cities, towns, and villages throughout Europe to round up Jews and shoot them. That was the order. Heydrich personally planned the sites for the death camps and organized how Jews should be transported. An example of the most evil perpetrator. But Heydrich was a family man with children. What about rescuers from the Gentile side? Well, Leopold Socker is another one of my heroes. Leopold was a criminal who became a sewer worker in the town of Lwów in Poland. In summer 1943, as the Nazis murdered the Jews remaining in Lwów, a Jewish family, a father, Ignacy Shigar, a Jew, dug a tunnel from his room in the ghetto and smuggled his family into the sewers. Leopold Socker and his co-workers found them, and even though they were aware that if caught helping Jews, they would be executed, they decided to help Ignacy Shigar and his family. Leopold helped to feed and clothe 21 Jews in the sewers. 10 of those Jews survived, and Leopold led them out of the sewers when Poland was liberated. An amazing man, a criminal, a sewer worker, but a rescuer of Jewish people. And then we tend to think about the guards, the perpetrators who were in the camps, and we forget that some of the guards and the most vicious guards were women. And one of those women was Irma Gries. Irma Gries was born in 1923 to a working class German family. Against her family's wishes, Irma Gries became an SS guard, first of all at Ravensbrück concentration camp, and then at Auschwitz murder camp, and finally at Bergen-Belsen. She became a vicious guard who beat inmates with a stick, shot many, and selected inmates for the gas chambers. A vicious, vicious lady. Now, the head of the SS, Heinrich Himmler, was the most powerful man in Germany after Hitler. It was the SS who carried out the Holocaust. The SS led the killing squads, the Einsatzgruppen, and they killed 500,000 Jews in Eastern Europe in the first 2 years of the war. It was SS doctors who carried out experiments. It was the SS who ran the camps, which eventually became murder camps for millions of Jews, gypsies, homosexuals, and political opponents. Now, I mentioned that there were Nazi Party members who rescued Well, this is another one of my heroes who was a Nazi, who joined the Nazi party. His name was Kurt Gerstein, and Kurt joined the SS in 1942 simply to find out if the rumors about the murders of patients with physical and mental problems was true. In the summer 1942, Kurt visited two of the Nazi death camps to witness the murder of thousands of Jews. He managed to get detailed information of this to the Swedish government, but they kept it secret because they didn't want to anger Nazi Germany. Then he managed to get the Dutch resistance to broadcast the information to the British government by radio. Even though the British Foreign Office were aware of the murders, they dismissed the report as exaggerated and untrue. The British government did not react to the information, and the murder of millions of Jews continued. Finally, Kurt reported all the facts to both the Roman Catholic and Protestant churches in Berlin, but they failed to speak out against the killings. In despair that no one would listen, Kurt committed suicide before the end of the war in 1945. That was Kurt Gerstein. Now, also, apart from Jews being murdered, there were also those who were mentally or physically impaired. They were murdered at the beginning of the war. They were Germans who were considered not worthy of life. One of these was Manfred, who was born in 1929 to a German family in Dortmund and grew up with his loving parents and sister Gerda. He was born with water on the brain and epilepsy, but he was a loving child. In 1942, his family reluctantly sent him to a children's care home at Applerbeck in the belief that he would receive better care than they would give him in wartime. His parents were unaware that Applerbeck was part of a secret euthanasia program in which the doctors and nurses killed patients in their care. If you want to Google that for more information, it's called the T4 program. 6 months after Manfred's arrival at Applerbeck, he was murdered by his doctors because they considered him unworthy of life. Manfred was one of 70,000 Germans who were murdered by Nazi doctors because they were disabled in some way. Now, I mentioned that clergy were part and parcel of the murders, and I have a copy of a Waffen-SS report of killings in the Pripyat marshes in the Ukraine on the 12th of August 1941. And this report says this: the driving of women and children into the marshes did not have the expected success because the marshes were not so deep that no one could sink. After a depth of about 1 meter, there was in most cases solid ground, probably sand, preventing complete sinking. The Ukrainian clergy were very cooperative and made themselves available for every action. Now, we're coming to the end of the presentation, but I can't finish my story on Holocaust without mentioning a camp called Jasenovac, or Jasenovic, depending on how you want to pronounce it. And that was a camp in Croatia. Many people don't know there was a camp in Croatia. But in this camp, it's believed, because there is some question in history about the actual amount, but believed to be up to 700,000 Jews, Gypsies, and homosexuals and Serbs who were murdered in this particular death camp. It's just south of Zagreb by the Croatian army called the Ustaša. And the leader of the camp was Miroslav Filipovic, and he was a Franciscan friar. As a Croatian extreme nationalist and fascist, Miroslav, as he would become known, combined his religion with an extremist political ideology. And the murders at that camp took place not by gassing, not by shooting, but by knife point. So we can see that we could go on forever teaching about Holocaust because it's such a very, very wide and huge subject. And I can detail much of this to you, but what I would ask you to do is, maybe if you're really interested, is click over onto a Wednesday night viewing to our Holocaust teaching on YouTube, and you'll catch up on that, and you'll get more detail. But suffice to say that Christianity fueled the Holocaust without a doubt. Nazi Germany, and I say this about Hitler, simply turned the key on the church doors that were bursting with anti-Semitism, wanting to flood out, and it did flood out, and ordinary people became Hitler's willing executioners. Of course, Hitler had planned the extermination of the Jewish people in his mind, and when he wrote his book Mein Kampf while he was in prison, 1923 to 1925, and he wanted to destroy the Jewish people from that time onwards. And a lot of what was in his mind then was connected to a eugenics program in America, which Hitler had got information about whilst he was in prison writing Mein Kampf. But he was also taught to be an anti-Semite through his background in Austria and through what the church had said. And I hope that I've been able to give you some flavor of that and give you some understanding. I hope it hasn't been too distressing for you tonight, and I hope it's been really interesting for you. And we've now moved away from these two sessions, Module 4 and Module 5. Now we come to a happier time when we look at the ingathering of Israel after 1948, after the war period, when Israel becomes an independent state. And we're going to look at that, the ingathering side of the story of the Jewish people, in Module 6 next week. So I hope that will brighten your heart and lift your hearts a bit, because God is faithful to the Jewish people. God is faithful to his promises, and he promised to gather the Jews back to their land. And I hope you stay with us for next week as we tell that story. So thank you very much, and a really good night to you. God bless.